Have you ever seen those beautiful buttons and loops on a high-end dress and wanted to try adding it to your own makes? They might look intimidating, but today I'm going to show you some easy tricks that'll make this technique totally achievable, including my favorite way to turn tiny, narrow loops with no fuss. Rouleau button loops are narrow fabric tubes that form delicate closures for buttons. They're made from narrow tubes of fabric that's been cut on the bias, so it easily stretches and bends. You then sew these loops right into a seam so they can wrap around a button instead of a traditional buttonhole. The first time I tried to sew these was for a bridesmaid dress, and I felt totally intimidated. I was convinced I'd ruin the beautiful silk fabric, but I was so pleased with the result that I now incorporate them into my everyday pieces too. So let's talk about how to sew them, and then I'll share some really inspiring ideas and ways to use them. Having the right tools makes this technique much more manageable. Here's what you need: an additional ½ yard of your main fabric for the bias strips, 1 yard of 2mm rat tail cord, my secret weapon for turning tiny tubes, regular sewing thread matching your fabric, water-soluble marking tool, small, sharp scissors, seam ripper for precision work, a zipper foot for your sewing machine, a small safety pin as an alternative tube turning method, iron and a pressing surface, and buttons that complement your loops. Here's a little tip. If your fabric is particularly slippery or delicate, consider using spray starch before cutting your bias strips. This makes them much easier to handle without stretching or distorting. Oh, and by the way, before I get into the tutorial, if you're interested in trying this out with a pattern that has this detail built in, check out our brand new lilac dress pattern that just came out. It's a romantic princess seam dress with loops and buttons down the front, and the perfect way to build this skill. I'm making one myself right now, which I'll show you in a future video. Okay, let me show you how to do it step by step. Step 1, prepare your bias strips. Cut 1-inch wide strips of fabric on the bias. The bias orientation is crucial. It gives your loops stretch and helps them turn smoothly around buttons. If the loops don't stretch, the button won't be able to pass through. If you're not familiar with finding the bias, it's the 45-degree angle to your fabric's grain. When you stretch fabric on the bias, it has much more give than when stretched along the straight grain. For multiple loops, you may need to join bias strips. Place 2 strips at right angles with right sides together and sew diagonally across. Trim the seam allowance to 1/8 inch and press open. This diagonal join helps distribute bulk and maintain the stretch properties of the bias. If you want to learn more about this, we have another video where Haley and I share 2 different ways to make bias tape, so you might enjoy that too. Step 2. Create your fabric tubes. Now for the magic ingredient, rat tail cord. This smooth, flexible cord makes turning tiny tubes so much easier. Lay your rat tail cord down the middle of the bias strip lengthwise on the right side of the fabric. Make sure your rat tail cord is longer than your bias strip by at least a few inches on each end. This is absolutely crucial for the turning method to work. Fold the bias strip lengthwise with right sides together, encasing the rat tail cord. First, secure one end of the bias strip to one end of the rat tail cord with a straight stitch. Switch to a zipper foot and stitch as close to the rat tail cord as possible without catching it in your stitches. Maintain an even seam allowance throughout. I've had the most success by stitching slowly and keeping the cord snug against the foot. This creates the smallest possible tube with even stitching. Carefully trim the seam allowance to approximately 1/8 inch to reduce bulk. Be careful not to cut through your stitching. This step is crucial. If you leave too much fabric, your tubes will be bulky and they won't turn easily. Step 3. Turn your tubes. Here's where the rat tail cord proves its worth. Gently pull the cord to turn the fabric tube right side out. Go slowly to avoid tearing. The first time I did this, it felt like a magic trick. The fabric just rolls right over itself as you pull the cord through. If you don't have rat tail cord, you can use a small safety pin attached to one end of your tube. Work the safety pin through the tube to turn it right side out. This takes more time, but it works in a pinch. Once turned, press your tube flat with the seam centered on one side. This helps create a smooth, professional finish. I like to use the tip of my iron and work slowly along the length of the tube. Now cut the finished tube into pieces approximately 2 inches long, or whatever length you need for your specific project. For standard button loops, 2-inch sections usually work well, but adjust based on your button size and your design preference. Step 4. Attach your loops. Use a water-soluble marking tool to create a reference grid on your garment where the loops will be attached. Mark both the stitch line and loop placement. I like to mark the center point of each loop first, then the edges where the raw ends will be placed. For professional results, ensure all loops are the same size and evenly spaced. Your loop should be wide enough to accommodate your buttons comfortably. A good rule of thumb is to make the width of your loop equal to your button diameter plus 2 to 3 millimeters for ease. Let's test this with our actual buttons. Fold each tube section into a loop shape, placing raw edges along your marked stitch line. Secure loops with pins, making sure they're all facing the same direction and are evenly sized. I find it helpful to place the pins perpendicular to the edge with the heads pointing out. This makes it easier to remove them as you sew. Using a straight stitch, Sew the loops securely within the seam allowance of your garment. Reinforce with a second line of stitching if your fabric is lightweight. Keep your stitching just inside the seam allowance line so it'll be hidden when you complete construction. Step 5. Complete your garment. Finish your garment according to the pattern instructions. When joining facing or other garment sections, ensure the loops are sandwiched neatly between layers. This can be a little bit tricky. Make sure your loops are tucked safely away from the raw edge so they don't get caught in your finishing stitches. Once construction is complete, press your garment carefully, shaping the loops with your fingers to ensure they stand out properly from the edge. Use the tip of your iron to press right up to the base of each loop, but avoid flattening the loops themselves. They should stand proud from the edge. Even experienced sewists encounter challenges with rouleau loops. Here are the most common mistakes and how to avoid them. Mistake number 1, using straight grain fabric instead of bias. This is probably the most common error. If you use straight grain fabric, your tubes won't turn smoothly and the loops won't have enough give to stretch around the buttons. Always cut your strips on the true bias for best results. Mistake number 2, making your tubes too narrow. If you stitch too close to your rat tail cord or use a cord that's too thin, your tubes may be impossible to turn. Start with a generous 1-inch bias strip and 2mm cord until you get the feel for the technique. Mistake number 3, not trimming seam allowances. Leaving too much fabric in the seam allowance creates bulky, unprofessional looking loops that can be hard to turn. I always trim to about 1/8 inch for smooth results. Mistake number 4, cutting loops before testing with buttons. I've made this mistake more times than I care to admit. Always test your completed tube with your actual button before cutting it into sections. This ensures your loops will be the right size. Mistake number 5, inconsistent loop size. Uneven loops instantly look homemade rather than professional. Use a template or ruler to ensure all your loops are exactly the same size. Mistake number 6, placing loops too close to the edge. If you place your loops too close to the edge of your garment, they may pull out with wear. Make sure the raw ends of your loops are well within the seam allowance for security. Mistake number 7, not reinforcing on lightweight fabrics. On delicate fabrics, a single line of stitching may not be enough to secure your loops. Add a second line of stitching or consider interfacing the area where the loops will be attached. If you're having trouble turning your tubes, try these. Use a thinner rat tail cord, make a slightly wider bias strip, stitch a tiny bit further from the cord, or ensure your seam allowance is trimmed evenly. If your loops are too small for your buttons, you can gently stretch them while pressing with steam, but it's better to remake them slightly larger. For fraying fabric, a tiny dot of fray check on the raw edges can help prevent fraying, but use sparingly to avoid stiffening. Alternatively, if your fabric is particularly prone to fraying, you can fold under the raw edges of the loop before stitching. If you're getting a bulky seam where loops attach, grade your seam allowances carefully around the loops and consider clipping corners for smoother results. I also find that pressing the seam open first, then to the side, helps distribute bulk more evenly. These delicate closures can transform many garment styles in ways you might not have considered. Here's some ways you can use them. Down the center back of dresses and blouses, creating a beautiful vertical line that's both functional and decorative. This is perfect for garments where you want a clean front design with no closure interruptions. At keyhole necklines, where a single loop creates an elegant closure that maintains the drape of the fabric. I found this especially beautiful on silk blouses and lightweight summer dresses. Along sleeve cuffs is a delicate alternative to buttonholes. This creates a more refined look than traditional buttonholes and works beautifully on lightweight fabrics where buttonholes might be too bulky. On wrap designs where loops can create a secure yet almost invisible closure system. I recently added loops to a wrap skirt and they provide both security and a lovely decorative element. As a design feature in unexpected places, I've seen beautiful examples with loops arranged along a shoulder seam or as decorative elements on pockets. For contrast, try using a different color or fabric for your loops, like a navy dress with bright coral loops, or a solid fabric with loops made from a stripe. This small detail can become the focal point of an entire garment. Many patterns can be adapted to include rouleau button loops, but here are a few ideas. Our new lilac dress actually includes rouleau loops in the design, making it perfect if you're trying this technique for the first time. It includes a modesty panel, so you don't have to worry about gaping and showing skin either. The hill dress would look stunning with loops down the center front rather than traditional buttonholes. In addition to replacing traditional buttonholes, you can use these loops to replace a tie in a wrap style. The Reggie dress could be transformed by replacing the tie with buttons and loops for a more sophisticated look. The Laura wrap skirt can be elevated with loops along the waistband, creating a secure closure that maintains the clean lines of the design. Another idea is using them at a neckline or keyhole. For example, with the Romy top, try adding a loop at the neckline instead of a tie for an elegant, subtle finish. If you're ready to perfect another essential closure technique for your handmade wardrobe, watch this video to learn all the secrets to sewing traditional buttonholes next.